name is Kayla Horan-Dimitrick. This event is hosted by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, your community for science and secularism. I've been a council member for Centre of Inquiry Canada, and I've been involved for about 6 years. CFIC is Canada's only national nonprofit with a mission of promoting and educating the public on critical thinking, science, and secularism. We work to equip people to make decisions based on evidence, rational thinking, and compassion. So to that end, we hold events like this to provide an opportunity for you to engage with subject matter experts on a variety of topics. In these days of physical distancing, all of CFIC's events are provided online, available from coast to coast to coast. So we'll be recording this talk for publication on CFIC's YouTube channel, including the Q&A section. So if you don't want your name or image to appear on the recording, just turn off your camera and change your screen name. To minimize background noise, we have muted everyone's microphone. We invite everyone to ask questions during the interview using the Zoom chat window. After the discussion, there will be an opportunity to ask additional questions, again, using the same chat window. We rely entirely on donations and memberships to allow us to bring you such events as this one. Please visit our website or email info@centerforinquiry.ca for more information or how to become a member or make a donation. So our speaker today is Marina Elliott, a Canadian biological anthropologist known as one of the 6 underground astronauts of the Rising Star Cave expedition. While working on her PhD in 2013, Marina was chosen to be part of a small team of scientists to excavate the Rising Star Cave near Johannesburg, South Africa. Her background in archaeology, caving experience, and the frankly incredible ability to squeeze through narrow spaces made her an ideal match for the select team. She's currently working at the University of, I'm going to butcher this name, Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa, where her continuing research at and around the Rising Star Cave focuses on the archaeology and anatomy of the human skeleton, forensic anthropology, and the archaeology of death and burial. So without further ado, you've heard enough of my voice. I'm going to turn it over to Marina.
Thanks, everyone. Let me just see if I can get the screen share up here. Okay. Now, is that working for everyone? I don't know if someone can tell me that.
It is working. Yes. It looks great.
Okay, super. Okay, well, without further ado, I'll just get going. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's actually just over 7 years ago that I landed first in South Africa to join the expedition. And some of you may even have followed it at the time, but today I know I have quite a mixed audience. So I'm just going to share a little bit of how I got involved with the expedition and what we've learned about this really intriguing species since then. So this, for me, all started back in October 2013 when I innocently opened an email one Sunday morning in Vancouver. And at the time, I was finishing a PhD in biological anthropology at Simon Fraser. And I was specializing in the study of human anatomy, variation, and evolution. And the email was from my PhD supervisor, and it included this Facebook post from Lee Berger, a paleoanthropologist in South Africa. And as you can see, the requirements were a little unusual. It sounded a bit mysterious, a little bit crazy, and not just a little dangerous, so I was in. And actually, one of the reasons I was so keen was that I'd always been a bit of an adventurer. I grew up in southern Alberta, in and around Calgary, and I'd spent lots of time climbing and caving and hiking around the Rocky Mountains. During my studies, I'd also done some field work in archaeology in some pretty extreme environments. First in Siberia, and then in northern Alaska, where we excavated with armed guards, not for dangerous people, but for the polar bears. And overall, I really thought I had a pretty good shot at this new job. It turned out, though, that almost 60 other people also applied for this position. In the end, 6 of us were chosen, 3 Americans, 1 Australian, and myself. Sorry, 4 Americans, 1 Australian, and myself. And I like to call myself the Canada arm of the group. And in part because we all had this sort of unusual set of skills and the right stuff for this job, we got nicknamed the Underground Astronauts. And within a month of Lee's post, we were all flown to South Africa to an area called the Cradle of Humankind, which was already famous for dozens of other hominin fossil sites that have been found over the previous 100 years. At the site that is now known as Rising Star, we helped set up a 60-person camp consisting of dozens of scientists, cavers, support staff, volunteers, and it was a massive undertaking. But at the time, Rising Star wasn't actually even on the paleoanthropology map. It had been a well-used recreational caving area for many years, but no one had really ever thought to look for fossils in it. But Lee had been working in the Cradle of Humankind for many years, most famously at a site called Malapa. And he had had a hunch that there might be more fossils to discover underground. So he had recruited some local cavers to keep an eye out for bones on their outings. Two of these cavers, Stephen Tucker and Rick Hunter, were exploring an area off the map in Rising Star and ended up in a really remote passage. After working their way down a series of really difficult accesses, they entered a small chamber and discovered a scattering of bones on the floor, some of which, as you can see in the center photo, looked suspiciously familiar. So they took these photos to Lee, who immediately recognized them as hominin and potentially really important. But the cavers said that the route was really, really hard to get to. So hard, in fact, that Lee would likely never get there himself, especially since, as he jokes himself, he'd become physiologically inappropriate for caving. So it was going to be a challenge. And just to be clear about how challenging this route was, if you start on the, I guess, right-hand side of your screen at the entrance, to get to the actual fossil chamber, the initial route follows a couple of narrow hallways, which is fine. You can still be up on your feet, but you sort of have to scooch sideways. But then very quickly you get to a little passage called the Superman Crawl. And the Superman Crawl is a narrow tunnel that you lie on your stomach and put one arm up above your head and one arm at your side, because there's not actually room enough for those people who have broad shoulders to get through with both arms up. And you literally lie on your stomach and scooch through the 3 meters, just pushing with your toes. So that's actually considered the easy part. Once you get through that Superman Crawl, you get into an area called the Dragon's Back, which is a long knife ridge of rock that's about 45 centimeters wide, but there's an 8-meter drop on one side and a 6-meter drop on the other. And you literally have to negotiate that wearing a harness and a rope. Then it gets a little bit harder. You get to an area called the Chute, which is a 12-meter long drop. As you can see on the bottom left corner there, it's literally just a crevice in the rock, and there's not enough room to look down to see where you're going. So you go in feet first and literally sort of feel for footholds and handholds, and you work your way down that 12-meter crack to an area that we now call the landing zone. And another little short passage brings you into the actual chamber itself. So it's really pretty challenging, and the process of getting in and out was a little rough on the body, as you can see from these photos taken in 2013. But in retrospect, really, I think all of us felt that it was so worth it, because after just 21 days of excavation in that first round of exploration in 2013, we had recovered over 1,300 fossil specimens, the largest single assemblage of fossils in Africa, and almost more than any other paleontological or paleoanthropological investigation in the world. And that was really a massive amount of material. This photo here shows just about a third of what we recovered in the 2013-2014 season in what is now called the Dinaletti Chamber. But it wasn't just the volume of material that was really unusual. The preservation of the Dinaletti material is really stunning. So unlike most other sites in the cradle, this material was just in soft soil, not in the hard breccia like you've maybe seen with other sites. And that maybe helped protect it, but what it allowed us to do was excavate more like a traditional archaeological excavation. And you can see these two skulls are pretty beautifully preserved, the teeth in particular. The demographic of the assemblage was also really interesting. In that first assemblage, we had 15 individuals, both males and females, ranging in age from neonates all the way to older adults. And now in the sort of larger Dinaletti chamber, we're up to about 22, 23 individuals. So that's really unusual. We also had some beautifully complete material like this foot, one of 5 that we have in the actual collection. And this one is really beautifully preserved. We also have a gorgeous, mostly articulated hand. It's only missing 1 small bone in the wrist. And we actually have parts of 7 other hands in the collection. This one was in fact, Becca Peixoto and I recovered this one in anatomical position, meaning it was lying in the soil the way it would have been in life. And that was really unusual as well. We have some superbly rare elements as well from the collection. These are tiny ear ossicles, Incus bones that we recovered from going through the back dirt in the lab afterwards. And we literally went through every teaspoon of dirt from the excavations and we recovered these 4 Incus bones. Prior to the Rising Star expedition, there were only 2 other of these bones in the hominin fossil records. So that was really spectacular to find. And since we had so much material after the expedition, when we started analyzing it, we realized that we had something very different. We had multiple individuals and almost every bone in the body represented multiple times. So we knew that the strange anatomy that we were looking at wasn't the result of a disease or injury, something like that. And we were really pretty confident about naming this as a new species. Overall, to look at the anatomy here, Naledi has quite a small brain, about 1/3 the size of a modern human, but has very human-like features in terms of its dentition and some of its other cranial anatomy. It also has very ape-like shoulders and upper arms, but much more modern looking lower arms. The wrists and hands are also much more modern looking, but the fingers are very, very curved, almost more so than we've seen in any other early hominin relative. The trunk and pelvis are also very archaic looking, but the lower legs are long and thin with feet that almost look indistinguishable from modern humans. So all of this totally unexpected. And if all of that wasn't enough, the physical context that all this material was found in was also really strange. During those first excavations, the vast majority of those specimens that we brought out came from a single excavation unit, 80 centimeters by 80 centimeters by 20 centimeters deep. Now that's about the size of a child's sandbox. So the volume and density of material was really unheard of before this particular expedition. Then, with the exception of a few modern bird bones and a handful of isolated rodent remains, there were no other animals found in the chamber with this huge volume of hominin material. So again, very, very unusual. Nor was there any evidence for occupation at the site. So we don't have any evidence for fire. We don't see any living floors, something like that, which you see in other archaeological excavations. There was also no evidence for carnivore or scavenging activity on any of the bones. Again, that's pretty classic when you have situations where a predator is dragging bones into a cave or a rock shelter. You'll see gnawing on the bones, or you'll see breakage patterns that are consistent with a predator or a scavenger. And we don't see any of that on the Naledi material. We know that the material couldn't have fallen in from above, as is the case in many other sites in South Africa, in part because we have a capping stone above the Dinaletti chamber itself. So we know that there couldn't have, just been material dropping in from above. And we know that in part because there was only Naledi material. If you have a hole in the ground, you would find other animals falling into those areas as well. But we also know that the material wasn't washed in by something like a river or a flood. This comes from our geological evidence in the sediments, as well as the presence of that beautifully articulated hand. And that's because all those bones would have been lost, those tiny, tiny bones would have been lost if there had been any movement of those sediments in the cave after it was deposited. So that's a really unusual set of circumstances as well. We do also know that the position of the bones came in over a longer period of time. All of this material didn't come in a catastrophic or mass fatality event. We know that they came in over a period of time. We don't really know how long that period of time is, but we have sort of layers of material. So we know it wasn't coming in a single event. And really at this point, we kind of ran out of ways to explain how all these individuals ended up together in this remote chamber in such concentrated area. And we were left with really the only reasonable explanation that fit the evidence. And so we had, you know, all these sort of lack of things, and we decided that really the only explanation was that Homo Naledi was deliberately disposing of its dead in this chamber. And that seems a little bit hard to accept for some people, but it's the only explanation that made sense given what we had in terms of the actual context. And, you know, in my mind, a single event is just a phenomenon, but to be truly convincing, it helps to find another example that begins to show a pattern. And at the end of that 2013 expedition, we found just that, a second locality of Homo Naledi remains in Rising Star. Now, the second chamber is called the Lacetti Chamber, and it's distanced from the Dinaletti chamber by about 140 meters of tunnel. And you actually have to go almost all the way back out to the entrance to get back into Lacetti. And if you can believe it, the excavation in that area is more difficult than the Dinaletti chamber, and it's only one excavator at a time that can work there. And as you can see in the top left there, it's basically working in the fetal position for hours on end, not exactly comfortable, but the excavation work is a little bit more difficult. But in that chamber, we found 3 more individuals, one of which is this beautifully complete male, which was nicknamed Neo, in addition to another adult and an infant. So once again, we have another location with multiple individuals, with very, very certainly Naledi in terms of the species. And, you know, it's just more convincing to say that this was probably a deliberate behavior on the part of this species. Now, that's pretty surprising, but at the same time that we found and researched this Naledi, Lacetti material, we also determined the geological dates for the Dinaletti chamber. And those were pretty surprising. So 335 to 236,000 years ago. And those dates were in part a shock because Homo Naledi's skeleton is such a mixture of modern and ancient features that a lot of other scientists, when we first came out with this, with the papers, suggested that Naledi had to be at least 1 million, if not more, you know, maybe even 2 million years old because of how archaic its anatomy looked. But we actually know from other species, like crocodiles and coelacanths from South Africa, that modern populations can look almost identical to their ancient ancestors that lived millennia earlier, and that it's just that the actual taxonomic line is very old, but populations can survive into modern times. So it is possible that Homo Naledi's evolutionary line is also very old, but that a single population, or maybe more, survived into recent times. And in fact, Naledi's not the only example of this. Homo floresiensis, who you may know as the hobbit from Indonesia, also shows some very, very archaic features, but lived relatively recently. It's been redated in the last few years to 100,000 to 60,000 years ago. So again, an anatomy that doesn't match well with its geological time period. And then just last year, scientists announced the discovery of another potential species from the Philippines called Homoluzonensis that also seems to show a small-bodied, archaic-looking species existing into relatively recent times. Unfortunately, there's not much material for Luzonensis yet, so its species designation and its relationship to other Homo species isn't certain, but as a group, these species are starting to show us a different pattern to human evolution, and one with a lot more nuance than I think we previously assumed. Now, another reason that Homo Naledi is so exciting is that during that date period, we know that anatomically modern humans were around at the same time on the continent. So may not necessarily have been in the same area, but Northern Africa certainly had anatomically modern humans at this same period. So it's possible that Homo Naledi and modern humans might have interacted. Now, we don't really know yet what those interactions might have looked like, but it's an intriguing set of questions. And we know from DNA studies that modern human groups did share variable ancestry with other hominin groups like Neanderthals, Denisovans, and at least 2, possibly more, as yet unknown species that are just kind of known as ghost species now. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. And Homo Naledi's discovery raises questions about the South African archaeological record as well with those dates. So In South Africa, there's not a lot of material in terms of skeletal material associated with the stone tools. So it's really difficult to say which species might have been making them during a specific time period. But once again, this isn't an isolated situation. The case in East Africa is also that there are multiple species on the landscape at the same time as there are stone tools, and nobody has the smoking gun of a hominin holding a stone tool to say which one of those groups might have been making or just even using the stone tools. So there's still a lot of work to be done in these areas on all of this. And for me, this actually reinforces that we still have a tremendous amount to learn about humanity's history, and that there's more going on in our family tree than we ever thought there was before. And for people like me, that's hugely exciting and really interesting. And it also emphasizes for me that exploration is not dead. As a kid, I was one of those little geeks that loved reading about daring explorers and exploration. But you know, in the end, I kind of thought the age of exploration was over and that there wasn't really anything new to find. But that's totally not true. Homo Naledi was discovered in a well-known cave in an area that was already famous for fossil finds. So there's no reason to think that there aren't many more discoveries to make, and some maybe even in our own backyards. So, you know, don't lose heart. And really, almost all of us get interested in our family trees at some point, where we come from and where we, you know, why we are the way we are. And for me, human origins research is deep time family history. And since it's about all of us, I think we should all be interested and engaged with the science and the research. And, you know, whether it began in Eastern Africa or Southern Africa, it's absolutely true that the roots of humanity are in Africa. And that gives us an important opportunity to consider what it is and what it means to be human. And it also gives us the chance to focus on the things that we share rather than maybe our differences. And, you know, particularly, it's kind of auspicious that we're having this discussion today, maybe, because in these sort of trying times when it seems like the world is increasingly divided and people are more divisive than ever, it might not be such a bad thing to focus on our commonalities rather than our differences. And so in the end, you know, we have so much more to learn about our past and in ways that can potentially inform our future, that I think we can all be part of that in a really positive and interesting way. So I think I went a little quick on that, but if I kick it back to the questions, maybe we can focus on what everybody else is interested in, because I know there are probably lots of questions.
Thank you very much, Marina, for a fascinating presentation. And now we will have an opportunity for people to ask questions, and we're asking you to use the chat window to pose your question. And so what we'd like to do, you can, if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat icon. Click on that, pose your question in text. This session, as Kayla mentioned earlier, is being recorded, so you can indicate if you would prefer to not have your name used in the question. And so yeah, so are there any questions in the chat? Go ahead. Well, Gus, the president of CFIC has a question, and okay, so but we will let Brian Gardam's question go first. Were there any artifacts found other than human bones?
No, there were not any other artifacts. We have no tools. We have no indication that this species was living in the area. We've got really nothing other than the bones.
Okay. Gus, since you are the host of this meeting who invited Marina, we will make an exception for you and allow you to ask your question out loud. So go ahead, Gus.
Thank you. Marina, if these bodies were being deposited on purpose, does that tell us that, might we speculate that there may have been some spiritual component to that?
That's an excellent question. You know, that's one that we've sort of struggled with, because I think, you know, there's we're very careful to say, at least in our team, we're very careful not to use the word burial when we talk about Homo naledi, in part because Homo naledi is very much not human. If it got on the bus with you, you would get off very quickly. So it is not human, but it's engaging in a behavior that I think, you know, the only explanation is that it's engaging in a behavior that shows intentionality, shows that there is something going on there. And so we use the deliberate deposition phrase for what's going on in the Dinaletti and Lacetti chambers. But, you know, we know from other species that there are, you know, hints of things like mourning and grief in other animals. And, you know, we're also starting to learn new things. There's some research on chimpanzees that show that they engage in behaviors that are ritualistic in the sense that they are repetitive and in a single location, but there's no functional purpose to it, like dropping rocks into an empty tree trunk over and over and over again every time you pass that place. So for me, you know, it's more of a spectrum of behaviors. And, you know, we thought this every time you deal with anything that has to do with humans. You know, we thought only humans use tools. We thought only humans had language. We thought only humans had culture. And the more research we do and the closer we look at other species, we realize that they also have elements of that. They may not have it on the same level, but it's a spectrum rather than a either or. So I don't find it disturbing that Homo naledi was on that spectrum. I think it's incredibly interesting and gives us an opportunity actually to think about, you know, what it means to be human and what divides us from the rest of the animal kingdom. And to me, that's really interesting.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer.
Sorry.
So I have another question. The question is from Heidi Gagne. Do you think that they were aware of their existence, the Homo naledi, aware of their existence, and were they smart in such a way that they might have understood emotions, feelings, etc., in the way that humans do?
Wow, that's a philosophical question. You know, as a scientist, I don't have any evidence for that. So all I can do is speculate. But from the behavior that we see and the evidence of the behavior that we find in the Dinaletti and Lacetti chambers, I think you have to assume that there was some intentionality there. And so it's not such a stretch to think that there was a thought process, an intentionality, a preconceived idea about separating the dead from the living. So there's something going on there that this species thought, okay, you know, we want to remove these dead from the outside or upper world. Why they would do that, you know, is not my purview to speculate, but I think it does suggest that there was something more unusual going on with this particular species. As for emotions and that kind of thing, I mean, again, we are part of the animal kingdom, and you can see latent signs of that in lots of other species. All you have to do is look at cats and dogs, and I don't think it's necessarily unfair to anthropomorphize. Maybe we should zoomorphize humans more, but you can see behaviors very like our own in other species. So to then find a species that's much closer to us than what we see in the extant animal kingdom, I don't think it's a stretch to say that there was something going on there that isn't too far off from what we've got.
Thank you. I love the word zoomorphize. I'm going to look for an opportunity to use it soon.
I'll send you a book. There's a fantastic book.
Please do. Thank you. Okay, so next question from Gail. How on earth did the initial cavers end up in the Dinaletti chamber? They must have been very adventurous to get there.
Yes, I think most people, both for the underground astronauts and the cavers generally, it's not so much a question of adventurous as slightly crazy. Yeah, so Stephen and Rick are cavers for sport, as I was before I got involved in this. So there's an odd group of people in this world who just go underground and try and stuff themselves places they shouldn't, just for fun. And so they were in this cave literally looking for areas off the map to explore. And that really is basically the definition of exploration, is to go where no one else has gone before. And these guys had been primed to look for material, but they were just out there for fun and happened across this material. And I mean, thank goodness, because it's been an incredible ride ever since. But yeah, they were just out there for fun initially.
Thank you. Here's a question that calls for a little bit of speculation. In your opinion, if or when two Homo species encountered each other with a higher level of social intelligence compared to other animals, how do you speculate these interactions might have been? Would they have been hostile, cooperative, neutral?
Well, that one slide alluded to that. I mean, I think it's probably, quite frankly, all of the above. I mean, what do humans now, human groups, cultural groups, do when they meet other cultural groups? They sometimes they sometimes breed, they sometimes fight, they sometimes simply cooperate. So I guarantee that any one of those is possible and in fact probable. And as I said before, we know from the DNA that modern human groups were doing exactly that, interbreeding and engaging either culturally or more with at least 3, possibly 4 other species. And so whether or not we saw Naledi as close enough to interact with, meaning either cultural exchange or any other form of exchange, is hard to know. But I think one way or the other, we probably would have, if we had been on the landscape at the same time and connected with them, we would have either treated them like other animals in that we killed them and moved along, or we would have said, oh, maybe you have something that we can learn from, and vice versa. So the bigger question is whether there was a communication system that could allow both groups to interact on a verbal level, maybe, and we don't know that yet. We've still yet to find a hyoid, which is the bone in here, which tells us the most about speech, but we'll see. I think it's probably all of the above.
Thank you. We have a question about the chemical characteristics of the soil. So what were the characteristics of the soils in these particular caves that differed from the other soils on the surface? Might be something about acidity, and what are the hopes of finding additional remains?
Yeah, that's great question. We don't really know why this material seemed to stay in soft rather than brecciated. Most of that, I think, probably has to do with time. I mean, 300,000 years is not very much time in paleontological terms, whereas most of the material that we find that's in hard breccia, is much older than that, up to millions of years old. So that might be part of it. The soils in Dinaletti and Lacetti are actually quite damp. That's one thing I didn't mention. Inside the Dinaletti and Lacetti chambers, the temperature stays a pretty constant 18 degrees Celsius, but it's at 99% humidity. So for us working down there, it's a bit sticky, but the soils stay sort of, I guess, heavy would be the word to use. They don't kick up a lot of dust, and the material that is in there appears to have been water saturated in cycles, because the water table isn't too far below where we find the bones. So it's likely that it rose and fell over time, but not to the point where it disturbed much of the bones. So, and as far as acidity goes, it's pretty neutral, but again, I think it's really mostly time that has allowed that material to stay intact as well as it has. And yes, there is lots of more material to find, I'm sure. It's just a matter of getting back in there and doing some more concerted exploration, excavation.
Thanks. Next question. Can you speculate about whether the access to the cave might have been easier in past?
Yeah, fantastic question. So when we were initially doing this research, you know, nobody could believe that Homo naledi was going the route that I described for you that we did, because you know, as I joke, I complained about dragging my backpack through that route, never mind my dead grandmother. And so it's one of those things that we really looked hard at. And up to that point of the chute where it gets really narrow, that 12-meter long, there might have been another entrance. We certainly see different sediments on one side of the chute than we do on the inside, on the chamber side. And we see other fauna, both in breccia and loose on, you know, on the outside side of the chute. So it is possible that there was an easier access, you know, before then, and that Naledi wasn't having to go through the Superman crawl and up the dragon's back and on and on. But basically, once we get to the chute part, the geology has not changed. So, and especially once again, 300,000 years is not a tremendous of time for that kind of geology to really move. So when we first were looking at this, I speculated that maybe Naledi wasn't, you know, dragging the bodies all the way into the Dinaletti chamber. Maybe they were simply tipping them into the top of that crack, and the bodies were sort of working their way down through the chute and then kind of plop at the bottom in the landing zone where we drop in. But research that we've been doing over the last couple of years suggests that no, that's not the case, because we're also finding semi-articulated material at the base of the chute and further in, and there's a kind of a choke point between the two that really suggests that you couldn't, you know, be just having material flow from one end to the other. So we're once again at this point where the evidence is telling us that they were being brought all the way into that area, and that they could only have done that via the chute. So, I mean, they are a little bit smaller than us, smaller bodied than the average modern human. So they're about, you know, somewhere in the range of 40 to 55 kilos, and, you know, a little bit, I don't know, in the range of a meter and a half at the most. So who knows, maybe they just had an easier time of it.
Thank you. I think this question has come up before, but just again, do you have a speculation as to their intelligence compared to the other hominins at the time?
Yeah, well, who knows? They have a very small brain, but we know from lots and lots of other evidence that a small brain has very little to do with smarts. And we actually know from some of our research on the internal surface of the skull, on looking at the endocranial anatomy, that Naledi appears to show brain, you know, sort of brain surface convolutions that suggest that it was a more complicated brain than you would expect for the actual volume. So it's really more about organization than size, and Naledi appears to be showing a small sized brain, but a more complicated brain than we would expect for that size. So that's really interesting. And that research is, again, just in its infancy still. But, you know, I think you can say that intelligence, whatever that means, they weren't dummies. They were doing something very interesting, and we just need to retool our understanding of intelligence rather than just assume that smarts only comes with a big brain.
Thank you. This question is from Rose, who has seen the paleontological exhibits of Naledi at Maropeng.
Oh, awesome.
And so she wants to know, are the excavations still going on in these chambers, and have other chambers with Naledi been found?
Great question. So since 2013, and I'm actually now in Canada at the moment, but was in South Africa up until December this past year. So in that 6-7 years since the initial discovery, we've been working very hard both in 101 and 102. So that's the Dinaletti and the Lacetti chambers. And excavations at the moment are going on in the Lacetti chamber, on the floor of the chamber there. But a lot of the research has moved to another area. People may have been following Lee's post about a new area called 105, which is sort of close-ish to the rising star cave system, but not actually connected to it. So they're starting to do some excavations there, but it's a little bit more difficult because it's actually brecciated material and it doesn't appear to be Homo Naledi. But yes, and then up until last year, we were still doing excavations in 101 and explorations in and around the Rising Star Chamber to see whether we could find more Homo Naledi material and where other material might be. So yeah, I guess the answer is watch this space. There probably will be papers and other research coming out about some of that in the next little while. But yeah, at the moment, there aren't any excavations going on in 101, but there are some limited excavations going on in 102, and then the focus now has moved to 105.
Thank you. You talked about this a little bit when you mentioned that you hadn't yet found a hyoid, but the question is there any way that we can know how they might have communicated with each other?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And actually that one slide about those tiny little ear ossicles is our clue. So a couple of years ago, I published a paper on those Incus bones. And one of the nice things about the Incus, and in fact the ear anatomy generally, is that it forms quite early in fetal development and gives us indications not just about positionality. So obviously an upright existing species versus a quadruped, something that walks on 4 feet. There's a difference in the way that we feel the world. So from the ear anatomy, we can tell whether an animal was upright or down on all fours. So that's really interesting. But in addition, the ear anatomy gives us an indication of how well a species hears and in what range. So that paper is available for people to read. And if you can't get it or it's behind a paywall, just email me and I'll send it to you. But from that research, we actually can assume that Homo Naledi heard in a range that humans communicate in. And Neanderthals also, there's been a bunch of research done on Neanderthal hearing and communication abilities. So it does appear that Homo Naledi's ear anatomy is at least consistent with the ability to hear in a human vocal range. So that's really cool.
That does sound cool. Yeah, I think it would be great if you could assemble a reading list for people that want to find out more, because there's that paper and then on zoomorphism, etc. So
absolutely, yeah, I'll put something together.
Okay, next question. Based on the material you found, is there any way you could tell something about their diet?
Yeah, actually the diet is not too difficult because we look at teeth, and that's probably the most direct conduit to what an animal eats, whether it's human or otherwise. So the teeth of Homo Naledi are really interesting. They generally, I think from that one photo or a couple of photos you saw in my presentation, they look very similar to human teeth. They're small, they're pretty uniform. There aren't these huge long canines the way you see in some other extant primates. They have some unique differences that are special to Naledi, but overall, I think we can safely say that Naledi was a generalist feeder. We can't really say with any specificity that they didn't or did eat meat, or if they were eating meat that they were hunting it versus scavenging it. But I think we can say pretty confidently that they were eating some amount of protein, some amount of vegetable matter, but that whatever they were eating, it was a pretty generalist diet. They weren't specializing in hard nuts or tubers the way you may have heard about Paranthropus species. And they weren't specialized predators so that they then developed these long canines. And from that dentition, we can also probably pretty confidently say that the sexual dimorphism, the difference between males and females, was somewhat reduced from species like gorillas, for example. So the differences between males and females were less exaggerated than some other primate species, which once again has some interpretation about behavior and social activity. But yeah, generally sort of general feeders.
Thanks. We have another question about general behavior. And this one is from Sophie Schulman, our branch manager out in Victoria.
Cool.
And the question is, what evidence do you have, if any, that there was consciousness and not just intelligence? For example, is there any evidence that they were taking care of elderly or sick members of their?
That's an excellent question. And that, you know, a lot of that comes from parallels with Neanderthal behavior. And if, you know, for people who are interested in that area, there's been a lot of talk about Neanderthals and modern humans taking care of conspecifics, so other members of their group, and that showing up as individuals with healed fractures, or individuals who were handicapped in some way, or differently abled in whatever way, that obviously lived into an older age, that meant that they had to have been taken care of by other members of their group. So we don't have at the moment any evidence for that in Homo naledi. In fact, we have very little in terms of evidence for disease or even for injury in Homo naledi, which is really interesting. So we have some minor fractures in the feet that suggest that they were walking long distances. But other than that, we don't have a tremendous amount of evidence for things like trauma or disease in Homo naledi. Now, that might just mean that the individuals, you know, died before those diseases could manifest in their skeleton. But at the moment, we don't really have any evidence to suggest that individuals were taking care of other individuals. So that's about as far as we can really speculate.
So we have a related question from Brian Garden of, have you been able to determine the cause of death for any of the individuals?
Yes, short answer, no. We have not. As I said, with that volume of material so densely packed in those excavation units, the material is quite commingled, and it was very difficult to kind of determine who or what belonged to whom. So we don't, you know, especially in the Dinaletti chamber where the individuals were mixed up, it was even quite hard to tell or to separate out a single individual. That was one reason also that the Lacetti chamber was so good for us, was that one male individual that we nicknamed Neo was kind of by himself. So we could reconstruct a whole skeleton and actually say, okay, this is what their limb proportions looked like. This is what an individual kind of looked like. But from both his skeleton and the skeletal material that we've got from the Dinaletti chamber, we don't have any obvious causes for death. We don't have any, you know, cranial trauma or trauma on the body that would suggest a violent death, nor do we have any evidence that, you know, that they were falling down that chute and breaking bones as they went down. Most of the breaks that we do find in the material are after deposition and after death. So they've been broken simply because other material fell on top of them, or because the sediments put pressure on them and broke the material up. So unfortunately, at this point, we don't have any cause of death for any of the individuals, but that may come with more sophisticated techniques as time goes on.
So it, again, sort of related along this line of inquiry, question from Joshua, do we know that the bones were from dead people that were deposited there already dead, or might they have been alive when they arrived?
That's a fantastic question. And again, we don't necessarily know that they were alive or, you know, dead when they got into the chamber. What we do know, though, is that for many of the bodies, they still did have soft tissue, flesh and muscle and skin on them when they went into the chamber and were deposited. And one of the ways we know that is from that hand that I showed you. So that hand was sitting in the sediments with the fingertips curled over the top of the hand like this. And so all those tendons and muscles and soft tissue had to have been present when that hand was deposited. And then afterwards, that material, you know, decayed away and the hand stayed in place. So I think it's pretty certain that well, pretty certain. It's hard to know whether they or some of the individuals were alive when they went in there, but I think it's more fair to say that they were probably dead when they went in, but certainly some of them at least were fleshed when they were deposited.
Thanks. We're moving on to a couple of questions about general evolution, about where Homo naledi fits. So the question is, where does it fit within the human lineage, if anywhere, and how has it been incorporated into the timeline?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And again, one that we have not fully answered yet. I mean, if you remember, Homo naledi was only found 7 years ago. We did the first publications 2 years after that. And so, you know, it really is just the tip of the iceberg so far. And there's a tremendous amount of research still to do. As far as its place in the hominin family tree, I think, you know, there's enough anatomy that is similar to our own, that it's pretty solidly in the Homo genus. So I don't think that's really contested anymore. And I think its species designation as a separate species from anything else that we know already is pretty solid. But where it fits is pretty hard to say, especially since we have this anomalous situation where we have a species that looks much older than the population that we're considering at the time. So, you know, it's safe to say that that linear kind of ladder of evolution of something Australopith-like moving into Homo habilis, moving into erectus, moving into, you know, Homo sapiens is out the window. But that's been out the window for a while as a result of a bunch of different species. So Homo naledi is just another piece of evidence that strongly demonstrates that. And we may never really know whether Homo naledi, you know, is a distant cousin or a more closely related cousin or on a direct line. There are some tantalizing ideas in terms of the DNA and in terms of things like proteomics now that may get at those questions. So we might just have to wait for better technology. So in terms of its position in the hominin family tree, unknown at this stage, but it's certainly, you know, being worked on pretty heavily, and something that hopefully we'll get closer to an answer for.
Thanks. I'd like to move on to a couple of related questions we have about the mechanics of getting into the cave. So a couple of questions. One is, has anybody considered expanding the cave? Is it an issue with destroying the remains, an issue with equipment? What about the possibility of using robots? And a couple questions about, you know, why is it so hard? Why aren't there any other accesses? So I don't know, Marina, if you'd like to bring up the map again and
Yeah,
speak to that.
see if I can get that. Where have I gone? So you'll just have to maybe bear with me here for a second, and I'll see if I can. Okay, so yeah, let's see if I can get that for you. Okay, so now is that showing up well for you guys?
That looks
okay,
good.
So the first question was about expanding the access so that it's not quite as painful and onerous as it currently is. And that was discussed during the first expedition and thereafter. And there's a couple of reasons that we didn't do that. First of all, the cave is in dolomite. It's not super stable. I mean, it's been pretty stable geologically for a while, but we didn't want to disrupt that. And I think also we're in a point in the world where we're trying to be more conscious about our impact on the planet and our impact on the environment. And so we didn't want to just sort of blast our way in, even if we could have done it in a way that protected the fossils. So part of that is environmental, is we just really didn't want to muck with the cave itself. And it is beautiful. It's a stunning environment to be in. There are, areas of the cave that there are beautiful stalactites and stalagmites. And so we didn't want to destroy that just because we could. And we have the tools, like myself, to get in there without destroying any of that. And then the other reason that we didn't want to just kind of blast our way in is the idea around respecting, if it is a decision or a behavior of this species to take their dead into this space and separate them from the outside world. It's, you know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, that they're not human, so we can't really apply human emotions and intentionality to them. But at the same time, if our hypothesis that they were taking their dead into this space holds, and as it still does, then we want to show a bit of respect for that and ensure that that space stays as respectful as we can while still trying to do the research and understand more about the species. So that's sort of the primary reason for not just kind of blasting our way in. The second question was about the use of robots in the cave system. And we have done some experiments with that, about getting even drones into the area, getting them into some of the higher cave areas where we can't actually climb up and look into the various crevices for material. So we've done a little bit of that. There's some areas in behind the Lacetti Chamber that are even smaller than the Dinaletti access, that we've found some limited bone material in there. And those are really hard to get into. So we've talked about, you know, maybe trying to use, you know, little robots in there, or even just fiber optics, where, you know, taking a laparoscope in there and peeking in behind some of the crevices. So we've used a little bit of that, but not a tremendous amount. The other problem is that humidity in the caves tends to be very hard on equipment. So anything that goes in there has to be pretty rugged, and some of the equipment just isn't there yet. So that was the second question. And then the third question was about additional accesses, I think. So how do we determine if there might have been other accesses, if I understand the question properly? So we've done a tremendous amount of both exploration underground and things like ground penetrating radar on the surface to try and determine where there might have been other accesses. So both myself and my caving team have been in and out of almost every crevice that we can fit into underground. And then the geologists and some of the seismic people have been over and over and over the surface of Rising Star to try and figure out where there might have been other accesses. And so far, you know, we found some cracks here and there in the surface, but nothing that leads directly to Dinaletti or Lacetti, in fact. And so far, we're still at the point where we have to say, well, the only access really was down that 12-meter long chute. So if I've got all those questions, I hope.
I think that was everything. Yes. Yeah, we have time for just a couple more questions. So one question from Brent Luber: were there any possibility of recovering DNA?
Well, that is the never-ending question. Yep, we have tried and tried and tried to get DNA out of Dinaletti. And we've tried multiple labs and we've tried multiple techniques. Part of the problem, as I mentioned earlier, is that the material that you know, the Dinaletti material has been water saturated at some point in the past, and probably multiple times as the water table came up and down. So that tends to leach DNA out very, very quickly. And unlike some of the examples, Neanderthals in Europe, for example, where their environments are very cold, and that's very good for DNA preservation, the 18 degrees Celsius and the moisture in the Dinaletti chamber is very bad for DNA. But having said that, we will keep swinging away because the technology really is changing so quickly, and there are now alternate ways of getting at some of these questions in terms of protein analyses and some other techniques that are really very new. So we'll keep trying, and as the technology improves, that's one of the reasons for not kind of just dragging every bone we can find out of the chamber. If we leave some of that material in there, once the scientific techniques improve, that we might be able to get at those questions a little bit easier later, and at least we haven't contaminated the material with our own DNA. So I think probably in the next 5 or 10 years, we might be able to get DNA out of Naledi, and then that might answer that other question about how they're related to us as modern humans.
Thanks. So this is going to be, unfortunately, the last question. And it's a bit of a multiple part question.
Get my pen out.
Well, it's not very technical, but anyway, yeah. So the first part of the question is, how, in what way does learning about this species and looking at fossils in general give you a better understanding of our human life now, or life in general? And then a sort of bit of a follow-up for people who might be interested in volunteer or amateur paleontology. What kind of opportunities are available?
Okay, really great questions. So as I think I alluded to towards the end of my talk, certainly for me personally, learning about fossils and understanding our past evolution and adaptation and all of that is really about understanding who we are and where we come from and why we are the way we are today. I mean, all of that is about a history. And so just like a family history where, you know, learning where your relatives came from and how they migrated around the planet, or, you know, why you have brown eyes and your sister has blue eyes, all of that kind of stuff is really about, you know, knowing thyself. And I think with paleoanthropology and human evolutionary research in particular, it really is about understanding who we are, where we came from, and that might inform why we make decisions the way we do today, and might inform how we make decisions and where we want to go in the future. So for me, it's looking at a whole kind of trajectory and history, and using that knowledge to actually inform how we want our lives to look currently and what we want our species and our planet to look like in the future. So for me, I do think that, you know, if you don't understand history, you are in some ways doomed to repeat it. And I think it's useful for us as a species now to understand how we got to this point and actually think about and mull on where we want to go from here. So for me, that's sort of why it's important to think and learn about this stuff. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's just scientists doing that as well. I'm a big fan of citizen science and people all over the world engaging in this. You can be from any walk of life, and this is still all about us. So it's worth listening to and paying attention to and being informed about. The second question about amateur paleoanthropology or opportunities, you know, there are lots of ways to get involved. I think probably the best way is simply to start reading about the material and asking questions, both of yourself and writing to specialists like myself, who are very happy to answer questions. I do a lot of talks, both, you know, like this remotely now, but in-person talks. I do talks for schools, I do talks for organizations. And one of the reasons I like doing that is that I get fantastic questions from the public. And people are really interested and ask really, really interesting questions that I can then, as a specialist, go back and think, well, actually that's worth thinking about. And sometimes you get those questions from really interesting places that you might not expect. In terms of volunteering, you know, obviously Rising Star is not going to be open to volunteers anytime soon, but there are lots of places where you can go and help with digs, both in terms of paleontology, like here in Alberta. I'm in Calgary at the moment. There's lots of ways to go on a field weekend or get some experience. But yeah, just keep an eye out. I can, along with my little list of things, if people want to do more reading, I can attach some links. But you know, there are lots of organizations who welcome volunteers to come out for a day or longer, and you can just get a sense for whether archaeology or anthropology or paleontology are for you. You know, if you like to get dirty and squeeze yourself into places you don't belong, then maybe cave archaeology and cave paleoanthropology are for you, but it's definitely not for everyone. But I can send some links.
Thank you. Do you have any final comments, Marina, that you'd like to?
I don't think so. I'm really pleased at the moment to be back in Canada. It's really nice to be here. And I'm very happy to see that there are so many people still interested in Homo Naledi and in human evolutionary research. So I'm happy to pass my email along to the CFI if people have additional questions. I'm always very, very happy to answer them if I can. And yeah, happy to do this again if we learn something new.
Thank you. For people who would like to express their appreciation electronically, since we can't clap, if you go to the participants tab and tap on more, then you should get a clap icon. So that will be our inaudible clap. So again, thank you very much to Marina for the wonderful presentation and to everybody for attending. I have a few closing remarks I'm going to make on behalf of Center for Inquiry Canada. I am the Vice President. We're happy to have Gus as the President who invited Marina here. CFI Canada is Canada's only national nonprofit for scientific inquiry and secular community. And we hope that any of you who are not already members will consider purchasing a membership. We'll include a link to the membership page in the chat window, and you can also get it through Meetup. Your membership provides financial support to CFI Canada and adds your voice to that of others who support science, critical thinking, and secular community. We advocate for evidence-based decisions on government policy, healthcare, public education, and human rights. It's only $30 a year to become a membership, so we hope that you'll consider joining. And thanks very much to all the CFI volunteers with this presentation and for the rest. If you'd like to volunteer, you can also sign up for our website. Again, thank you very much, and until next time.
Thank you to everybody as well.